My name is Ebonie Smith. Today we will be broadcasting live from Memphis, Tennessee. I will be going in the studio with one of my favorite bands, The Privilege. We're going to be recording drum and bass today, and we're going to be doing a masterclass showing you a little bit of how I think about production, how I think about recording, what mics I use, what tools and tricks I use, and I hope you get a lot out of it. I'd like to give a special shout out to GRAMMY U. This masterclass is actually powered by Mastercard, our incredible sponsor. And also I'd like to give a shout out to the Black Music Collective for making this possible. Okay, so before the band gets here, I would like to take you into the live room to show you a little bit about my setup and look at the instruments and how I mic'd everything. Right now, what you're looking at is the way I typically set my drums up. This is, I guess you could say this is my standard, right? So I set these up, little on me, myself, last night. And I really take pride in doing it, right? Because it's actually a time for me to check out a little bit. Sometimes, especially if I'm doing it by myself, I put some music on, I listen to a podcast, like sometimes I even listen to my favorite TV shows on Netflix. And it's just really a zen moment for me. Like my mother considers what I do manual labor. She literally, I guess like what I do to her is like akin to construction, but I actually find it to be quite therapeutic to come in and set the drums up, put on my favorite pair of sweatpants and do what I do. So I have an assortment of drums here. So let's just talk a little bit about what's going on. So the first thing I'm always trying to think about is the drummer, right? Are they going to be comfortable? They can't stand, right? So we need to make sure that the drum throne is here, right? So we have to make sure that the drums are adequately tuned and teched. Okay, so tuning and teching has a lot to do with making sure that the drum hardware is sturdy, right? Making sure that all the lugs are not, falling on the ground, and making sure that the pedal is tightly secured, making sure that each head is tuned properly, making sure that the heads aren't old, right? Making sure that you have quality drum heads. And even if they're old, making sure that they are, at least that's a decision, right? If you have old heads, making sure that that's something that you actually decide to do. And also, making sure your cymbals are properly cared for, making sure you've chosen the cymbals that work for the type of record you're going for, right? Because dealing with cymbals is like dealing in the ocean. There's so many different types of cymbals, so many different types of types of wood that you can use for drums. And so you want to make sure that you've selected an assortment of different types of actual drums that you like, and that they're placed on hardware that is sturdy and it has been properly teched, and that you've tuned the drums to the song that you're working on, right? So that's quality. So if you are working in a song that's in A, maybe like tune your heads to tones that resonate in those frequencies, right? The frequencies that are associated with those particular keys, or the notes and harmonics in those keys. So the first thing, before you touch a cable, before you touch a mic, before you put a mic on a mic stand, before you even think about the room itself, you have to make a stern and hearty consideration about like the actual drum set itself, right? You also have to have a good player, right? That matters too. So now that we have our kit, now it's time to think about the room, right? So this particular room is pretty dead. And what do I mean by dead, right? That's not exacting language. Basically, what dead means is that the reverberations in the space have a very short decay time. So in this particular room, when I release the impulse response, like a clap, the sound that reverberates in the space only reverberates for about a second. In fact, it's slightly less than a second if you really listen. And you can also, as I'm doing it, I can hear a little bit of ringing. So you can actually hear that sound, hear that impulse response, and then you have to make a determination about, is the room too dead? Do I want the room to be more alive? right? A room that's more live obviously will have less treatment on the walls. If you look around at this room, you see absorbent materials, you see diffusers, you see all types of materials that help to absorb the sound and to create that deadness. So for example, under the drum kit, we have a rug, right? So the rug and the material that the rug is made out of helps to absorb some of the reflections that are coming from the floor. So as the sound is creating a complex array of impulse responses in the space that is actually pushing air pressure backwards and forwards, that sound is then reverberating off of surfaces. The fewer surfaces that are treated, the more reverberant the room will be. If you have a room that has tons of treatment on the walls, then typically that room will be less reverberant, right? So we've talked about the kit itself, the drums itself. Now we've talked about the room. So now we kind of talked about the kit itself, which is the ocean, right? We can talk about that for hours. We can also talk about rooms and spatial dynamics for an hour and acoustics for an hour, but we don't have that much time. So we're going to move on and start talking a little bit about my mic selection and why, and hopefully give a few little tips to folks that haven't had an opportunity to work in major studios, right? If you're working at home and you're like, okay, well, how does this apply to me? In fact, all the same recording techniques can be used if you're working at home or in your garage or wherever you are making music, because the truth is, the most important consideration is you and how you bring yourself to your music. But here's some really great techniques that hopefully, even though we're in a major studio, can be transferable to you wherever you are. So let's talk a little bit about mics, and I'm going to go in the direction of, in the order, I should say, of how I think about actual input list. So the first thing is a kick. I have an AKG D12 VR on the kick. And the cool thing is, if you engage the phantom power, you can engage some of the filters on the kick, which is really cool and interesting if you care to do that, because you can get a little bit more tone options out of a mic like this because of that feature, right? So, and another thing I think I like is that it really, for me, I have one kick mic. A lot of people use multiple kick mics. A lot of times I use multiple kick mics. But for the sake of this particular song, I felt like I just wanted to put up one kick mic right at the sound hold to allow the sound to travel out, right? I didn't want to be so close up on the beater, because one of the things that does is you get more snap. You get more of the beater sound, which is the attack of the actual impulse, right? The actual hitting of the kick drum, right? I wanted to get more, for lack of a better term, a washed out sound, where you're allowing the sound to travel a little bit more through the actual interior of the bass drum, which will give it a much more rounded sound and also a much more low end heavy sound, right? Because the track that we're going for today really does require that, right? So I'm putting this mic right at the sound hole. The next mic is a tried and true Shure 57. These are like the Chuck Taylors of like recording, I feel like. The Shure 57 or the Shure 58, right? But in this particular case, we're talking about the Shure 57, which is a dynamic microphone, which means that it's highly directional. And in this particular case where, you know, I'm recording the band all together in one room, directionality really, really matters. So condensers are not really my first choice because I want, first of all, a mic that's not going to see everything. Condenser microphones are so sensitive. They're powered. So they tend to be just overbearing with respect to how wide the frequency response is, right? Sometimes in a case of this particular recording, I wanted the mic to see a very narrow scope, right? And the polar pattern is a cardioid polar pattern. So I wanted it to be very directional, not picking up so much on the side, so much behind. And so these mics are really great. I have a matching 57 on the bottom. So it's always great, even if you don't plan to use it, it's always great to get a mic on the snare wires, just to have it, just to say you got it. Now, the thing to keep in mind is because of the placement of these mics, they're facing in an opposing way, right? So the very important thing to do is to make sure that you flip the phase, usually on the bottom mic, to ensure that you're getting a proper frequency response and you're not having unnecessary filtering as a result of phase issues, right? And the first thing that you'll notice when these two mics are out of phase is that the rich tone of the snare will practically drop out, right? Much of the mid-range, much of the lower mid-range of the snare will basically just completely disappear. Over here, I have a condenser mic, and I just talk to y'all all about dynamic mics and how they're directional. And then I put up this condenser mic on the hat of all things. And it's loud and it's obstructive and it's slightly obnoxious, but that's kind of the sound I'm going for, right? And also because they're powered, you tend to be able to also get a lot more gain from them than you would a ribbon mic or even a dynamic microphone. And the frequency range is more expansive. So sometimes the rules go out of the door when you are thinking about what the song requires. I have it facing down, just seeing the perimeter of the circumference of the hi-hats. And this is typically, for most of my drum sessions, how I place my mics, right? Let's move on quickly to these two dynamic mics that I have on the toms. These are Sennheiser 421s, pretty much staples, I would say, on toms. Once again, dynamic mics, directional, very important with respect to recording all in the same room, helps to eliminate phase or limit phase, the potential for phasing issues. And right now we're doing a little thing called making sure we don't have any phase issues. So what I'm doing right now is measuring the overheads according to the snare, right? So we can manage the proper phase relationships. And we can talk a little bit more about phase later, but basically what I'm doing at the moment is using this cord. You don't have to be super fancy. You can take any cord in the studio. At the top, we have a spaced pair of overheads. We have two ribbon mics, the Royer R122s. And these are actually active ribbon mics, right? So if you ever have an opportunity to work with active ribbon mics, they can actually support much higher SPL, right? Sound pressure level. And that can be great because sometimes you want the great sound of a ribbon mic, the smooth, sound of the actual ribbon. But the thing with ribbon mics is they tend to be quite sensitive. So the benefit of an active ribbon mic is to be able to support a much higher SPL level, getting the benefits of a mic that typically would be too sensitive to use within a drum recording scenario. Now, you do see Royers a lot as overheads, and because they really work really well as overheads, you typically won't see them placed in front of a kick or a snare because of the sensitivity. But once again, with an active pair, you can do a lot more. And in applications such as this, you can have more flexibility there. Perhaps less important, you would think, because this is not actually on a drum. But no, this is probably most important mic here because this mic is your talkback mic for your drummer, right? So you want to be able to communicate with your drummer. This particular drummer that I'm working with today, he sings, right? So it's important to have an extra mic. Sometimes you can make do just fine with mics that are on the kit. The overhead mics can sometimes really serve as great talkback mics for the drummer, but sometimes it's nice to give the drummer a little bit more juice in his or her own mic. The last mic we'll talk through is the room mic that I have up. I just threw up a U87 condenser large diaphragm transistor based, and it just kind of sounds great in the room, right? So I threw it up. When in doubt, just go with what sounds good, you know, when in doubt. But I like to have a mic that is up in the room somewhere, just catching the ambience, right? It's just meant to be in the room, capturing what they say is the vibe. I guess that's short for vibrations, you know, which actually has to do a lot with just how the sound is moving in the room, and also the players as they're doing what they do. It's just really great to have a mic up slightly off axis. And one of the things this helps to do is create the illusion of space, right? Because when you're close miking all these instruments, what you might be missing out on is the experience of the sound in the room, right? So if I'm this mic, I'm kind of like an audience member, right? I'm kind of just like sitting here as like a really, really tall 6-foot dude or lady, looking at this drummer playing. And it's basically, think of it as a perspective mic, right? And because of where it's positioned, not on the drum exactly, it's able to capture a sense of space. It's able to capture a sense of atmosphere, which is very important when you're recording drums, because it's not just enough to capture each individual drums. It's important to capture the collection of drums as an instrument, right? So that's pretty much the purpose of a mic like this. Where you place it depends on your room, depends on what you've learned about that room, having recorded in it many times, like where the sweet spot is. Lots of different engineers have a rule of thumb. I kind of don't. I move the mic around until I find a space that makes sense. This space made a lot of sense. I try to avoid corners. Because you have bass that gets trapped in corners, right? So I'm not necessarily looking to capture a lot of bass, but sometimes you might want to capture the bass in a room mic. Once again, it's about you experimenting and figuring out what works best for you. But overall, this is how I think about my drum setup. And I've had a chance to test this on lots of different artists. So if you're into Mr. Wives, you can check out the last Mr. Wives album. I recorded all the drums on that. And this was pretty much the technique that I used. Now that you've seen the drums, how I go about that, I want to bring in the privilege to talk a little bit about the bass setup. Hey guys!
Hello! How are you? Good. Greetings. We are the Privilege from Memphis, Tennessee. My name is Christian Underwood.
My name is Christopher Underwood.
We are twins, so you can kind of pick the name.
Our parents did that.
Yeah. But I am actually a GRAMMY U alumni. In college, I was afforded the opportunity to participate in various GRAMMY U programs and receive the benefits and educational opportunities and meet a lot of great people, and still reaping the benefit of that after having graduated 3-4 years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, love GRAMMY U. Thank you guys for all that you do.
We're back with Christian Underwood, our incredible bassist from the Privilege, who's playing too loud right now. It's fine. Just make it a little bit lower. You know what I'm saying? So like he has his bass rig here today. He has his Eden head down here, and he has his cab, and he has some pedals, right? So I'm gonna go quickly through what I've done here. The most important thing is these guys are gonna be playing together. So I have drum and bass in the same room. So I have to be adventurous, but play it safe. And what I mean by that is make sure I get everything DI, as much as I can DI, right? So DI meaning direct injection, right? Which you do by using these wonderful direct boxes. So these DI boxes here by Radial. I have a Radial duplex, and then I have a basic Pro D2, a stereo direct box as well. So how I have this rigged up is we're going out of his bass, instrument cable out, into the input of his pedal. And then we're taking the output of his pedal and we're going into this direct box, and I'm taking the through from the box and patching into his amp here, right? And I'm taking the output of this box and going straight to the computer. So that allows me to get the direct sound from his pedal, right? Because even though his pedal is going into the amp, I want the clean sound of the pedal, right? So I'm using the through to feed the head of the amp, right? And I'm using the output, the main output of the direct box to go directly into the multi-track in the control room. Doing the exact same thing with the amp head. In addition to the direct box setup, I'm using a mic on the actual cab. Personally with me, I like to, especially in close miking situations, I like to place the mic slightly off axis of the cone to get a full resonance from the actual cone itself. So that's a little bit about the DI setup that I kind of got going on, so that I can have as much control in post as possible. And that type of setup is one that I've used many, many times, and it works for me. Okay, now the bass is set up, the drums are set up, the guys are warmed up. Let's go into the control room and do a bit of recording now. There's a couple things I've learned about engineering. Always roll. Like my goal as a producer, engineer is for the artist to be able to come into the studio and just start playing. Because that's the first thing artists are gonna do. They get to the studio, they see the instruments, they're going to want to play. And it's the worst thing in the world to be like, I didn't get that. They come in, they jam, I didn't get that, right? Because some of the best music is the warm-up. And sometimes the best take is the first take, right? So you want to be in a position where the artist just, they don't have to worry about anything. Like, you've really taken care of all the technical details. And they're locked in for a number of reasons, right? Because they trust that I have the technical aspects pretty much covered, and that they trust they can hear themselves and they can hear each other. So your headphone cue is the most important thing. And for me, I always have a headphone cue next to me because I want to be able to hear at a moment's notice what the artist is hearing, right? If they're like, I can't hear myself, like, I don't want to have to run out there and say, well, let me figure out what it is. It's like, no, like, I want to make sure that what's happening in the headphones, what's happening with my board mix, and what's happening in Pro Tools, which are three different things, right? Like, my board mix is my on-the-fly mix. My headphone mix is what I'm sending out to the artist, which I've set up on a completely different mix using sends, right? So I have sends going to the artist where I'm basically busting out copies of everything that they're hearing, busting out a multi-track that's mixed in the box and summed in the headphone amp. So that's going on. And then there's my gain staging that's going on at the preamp level. And you know, I just need everything to be kind of right here, right? My board situation, my Pro Tools situation, which all of my faders in Pro Tools are set to unity because I'm usually mostly concerned about my gain staging. My gain mix is what I like to call it, my gain mix, which is basically the levels that I'm setting at my preamps, right, is the most important part, in my opinion, of the signal chain. So what you have is all these instruments that are coming from the live room through the internal signal paths and the cabling that is in the walls going into our patch bay. And the patch bay is basically where we do all of the configuring of the signal path, right? We have the most control of that at the patch bay, where we can essentially send signal and bus signal wherever we'd like to. So I have a handful of compressors in the mix. So I actually have the kick drum going through this 1176, which is pretty squashed, pretty good, all buttons in. And I have this DBX 160 here that I'm sending the snare through. It's doing some pretty aggressive compression, but I think it works for the tone of the song. It's limiting pretty good. And I have the bass DI going through this CL1B tube tech just to give a bit of coloration. It's not really doing, it's pretty squashed once again, but it sounds good, so we're good. Compression, in my opinion, helps to bring out some of the harmonics in the tones, tends to bring out the life in the instruments, I think, in my opinion. Things can be over compressed, things can be under compressed. Sometimes I err on the side of really gently compressing, not overusing compression, not overusing outboard gear. But in this particular case, I like how it sounds, right? So this is the kick soloed. Right? Our snare soloed. So you can hear some of the higher and more dynamic aspects of the sound have been heavily compressed and making room and space for some of the more ambient aspects of the sound to be augmented and featured a little bit more. And that was the type of sound I was going for. Let's take a listen at what we recorded today. All right, how'd y'all feel?
Felt good. I mean, it's in the pocket.
Okay.
It sounds great. Yeah, just this room. Yeah, the headphones were good. I could hear everything.
Right.
Yeah, I'm ready to hear it on
the panorama.
Yeah, on the situation.
Okay, here we go. What I ended up doing was just creating my buses for the headphones in the box, right? So I have basically all of the individual channels on pre-fader sends, and so I have a little mix happening, like a headphone mix. Actually, quite similar to what's happening here, right? So you see like the small faders here, and then the big faders, and the small faders in this particular case are like feeding Pro Tools, and the big faders are feeding the monitor system. In this particular case, the way it's routing is the audio is coming through Pro Tools and I'm busting it out to you. And I have these smaller faders that allow me to create a small mix that are busting out. And then I'm summing to these two buses, summing the drum mix, summing the bass mix, and then sending it here. So that allowed for a little bit more control, because at first I wanted to do the headphone mixes on the board. And then I was like, I think I will have more control if I do it this way in Pro Tools, and it was quick and easy. And I just did the routing. I kind of think of the mics as paintbrushes, you know? And we put up that room mic. So we have, in terms of like just mics that are capturing ambience, we have the overheads, we have the room mic, we have, and we, by accident, have these two mics that I recorded too, that are y'all's vocal mics. So those are fun too. So that 57 that you have is pretty, I'm sorry, the 58 that you have is pretty fun too. I mean, and you can tuck these and like verb them out. That's just, I think that's just
the 58.
Just the 58.
Wow.
And this is let me see that. Yeah, that's just the 58.
Wow.
So you have, you have so many options. So in post, I mean, you don't have to try to artificially create the room with a bunch of fake reverb. You know, you can really kind of like blend the mics and even like automate the mics to create a sense of spatialization and depth of field. But yeah, I mean, I feel good about it if y'all feel good about it, you know.
Yeah, we can tighten it up in, post.
Yeah, for sure. But I think we captured good stuff.
Yeah. Give a special thanks to the Black Music Collective, GRAMMY U, and of course to Mastercard for making this all possible. And thank you so much for staying with me. And I hope that you took a lot away from today.